The bond was meant to be an anchor in the storm of her new immortality. For Mira, it felt more like a fraying rope she clung to over an abyss. Her world had been stripped down to its essential elements: the cold, unyielding stone of Vlad's fortress, the searing ache in her gums that was the thirst, and him. Always him. He was the sun her new dark world revolved around, the only source of warmth in the endless, echoing night of her existence. She needed his presence not just like blood, but like breath, like the memory of a heartbeat in a chest that no longer beat. The bond, a shimmering, insistent hum beneath her skin, pulled her toward him with a gravitational force she was powerless to resist. Mira was human once, warm-blooded and mortal, with a heart that beat and lungs that breathed. Vlad was a vampire, an ancient immortal who had walked the earth for over 5 centuries, who commanded the night and ruled a vast domain carved from shadow and stone. He had turned her 3 months ago, and in doing so, had bound her to him for eternity through the sacred mate bond that connected their very souls. So she followed. She became his shadow, a silent attendant to a life she did not yet understand. When he held council in the great hall, its vaulted ceilings swallowing the flickering torchlight, she would find a seat in the shadowed alcoves, making herself small, trying to absorb the cadence of his rule through the stone. She would watch the way the lesser vampires deferred to him, the mix of fear and reverence in their eyes, and feel a strange, vicarious pride. This magnificent, terrifying creature was hers. The bond whispered it to her in every moment, a constant refrain beneath her thoughts. When he retired to his study, the heavy oak door a final barrier between his world and hers, she would wait. She would settle on the cold flagstones in the corridor, her back against the opposite wall, and simply exist in his proximity. The scent of old paper and spiced wine that bled from beneath the door was enough. The low murmur of his voice as he dictated letters to his advisor, Anton, was a lullaby. She was learning the shape of her new life by tracing the edges of his. The stone floor was hard beneath her, the cold seeping into bones that no longer felt temperature the way they once had, but she didn't move. To be near him was to feel tethered, grounded in a reality that still felt impossibly foreign. Her human life seemed like a half-remembered dream now, faces and places that belonged to someone else entirely. She believed this was what was required. She was new, a fledgling, her instincts a chaotic symphony she couldn't yet conduct. The bond was her only score, and it sang one constant, dominant note: be near him. She craved the casual brush of his hand, the moment his cool, ancient eyes would find hers across a crowded room, the proprietary weight of his arm around her waist when he guided her through the formal dinners with visiting dignitaries. These small moments of connection were sustenance, proof that she was not adrift, that this terrifying eternity had a center, and that center was him. She never imagined her need could be a burden. She thought it was the nature of the bond, a fundamental truth of their joined existence. All the books she had read in the fortress library about vampire mates spoke of inseparable pairs, of souls so intertwined they could not bear to be apart. She thought she was simply living the destiny that had been written for her the moment his fangs had pierced her throat and his ancient blood had mingled with her mortal essence. She was wrong. Then came the night the truth fractured. She was curled on a window seat at the far end of the long gallery, the moonlight striping the marble floor in silver and black. She had been waiting for him to finish his meeting with the emissaries from the southern territories. Hours had passed. The moon was high and cold, a pale disk in the obsidian sky. The sound of his study door opening sent a jolt of relieved energy through her. She rose, smoothing down her dress, ready to greet him. A hopeful smile touching lips that still felt foreign to her, fuller and more sensitive than they had been in her mortal life. But he was not alone. Anton, his brow perpetually furrowed with the concerns of the domain, was with him. They were walking away from her, their voices low and resonant in the hallowed silence. The gallery was long, and sound carried strangely in the ancient stone corridors. Mira's feet were frozen to the floor. She should have announced her presence, called out to them, made some small sound to let them know she was there. But a sudden, cold premonition held her still. A whisper of intuition that told her to be silent, to listen. Vlad sighed, a sound of profound, soul-deep weariness that cut her far more than a snarl ever could. He ran a hand through his dark hair, the gesture one of immense frustration, and in that moment he looked not like the ageless, powerful king she had come to know, but like a man carrying an unbearable weight. Anton noted in his careful, measured tone, the kind of voice used to deliver potentially unwelcome news to a volatile master. She is adjusting. The change is difficult for any fledgling. She is resilient, my lord, more so than many I have seen. Vlad's response came after a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity. Adjusting? Anton, she's everywhere. In my council, outside my study, in the training yards when I'm trying to focus on the recruits. I turn a corner and she's there, waiting. Always waiting. I can't breathe. I feel like I'm suffocating under the weight of her need. Every moment, she looks at me like I'm the only thing keeping her from falling apart, and I don't know how much more of it I can take. The words were not meant for her. They were a confession, a moment of weakness shared between a ruler and his most trusted advisor, spoken in what Vlad believed was the privacy of an empty corridor. But they struck her with the force of a physical blow, each syllable a blade that found its mark with devastating precision. She's everywhere. I can't breathe. Suffocating. The anchor she had clung to was not holding her steady. It was drowning him. Her need, which felt as essential and natural as the pull of the moon on the tides, was a crushing, unbearable weight on his shoulders. The hopeful smile on her face withered and died. The warmth that had flooded her at the sound of his door opening, the anticipation of seeing him, of perhaps walking with him back to the residential wing, of stealing a few more precious moments in his presence, turned to ice in her veins. In that moment, the shimmering hum of the bond became a scream of raw, agonizing shame. It was still there, that golden thread that connected her soul to his, but now it felt like a chain, a shackle that bound her to someone who saw her not as his cherished mate, but as an obligation, a burden, a needy, pathetic creature he could not escape. He did not see her as his other half, his complement, the piece that completed him. He saw her as a cage, and he was desperate for the bars to open. Anton's response was too quiet for her to hear, but she saw Vlad shake his head, saw the slump in his shoulders as they continued down the corridor and disappeared around a corner, their footsteps echoing into silence. She slipped back into the shadows of the window seat, pressing herself into the cold stone until her bones ached, until the physical discomfort was a distraction from the emotional agony tearing through her chest. She made no sound. She watched the empty corridor where he had stood, where he had spoken those damning words, and felt something inside her crack and then shatter completely. The bond still pulled at her, an insistent ache that wanted her to follow him, to seek him out, to be near. But for the first time since her turning, she recognized that pull not as guidance, but as a betrayal. Her own instincts, her own soul, were demanding she give him the very thing he could not bear. And in that silent, moonlit gallery, Mira made a decision. If her presence was a pressure, she would become a vacuum. If her need was a weight, she would learn to float, to exist without support, without the anchor she had thought she needed. If he could not breathe for her being near, then she would give him all the air in the world. She would disappear into the vast stone labyrinth of his fortress, and she would learn to navigate this eternity alone. The bond still screamed for him, a raw, open wound in her soul, but for the first time, she ignored it. She clenched her fists until her nails bit into her palms, welcomed the sharp sting of pain as a distraction, and made a vow to herself. She would not be too much. She would not be a burden. She would not be the weight that crushed him. She would be nothing at all. The change was immediate and absolute. The next morning, when the council convened in the great hall to discuss the winter supply routes, the alcove where Mira usually sat was empty. Vlad noticed, his gaze flickering to that shadowed corner with a slight frown. But the discussion demanded his attention, and he pushed the association aside. The flagstones outside his study, which had become worn smooth in one particular spot from her nightly vigil, remained bare. When he emerged that evening to find Anton, he paused, his hand on the doorframe, and glanced down the corridor. It was empty. A strange, uncomfortable feeling settled in his chest, but he dismissed it. Perhaps she was resting. Perhaps she had found something to occupy her time. The training yards, where she had taken to watching him drill the younger vampires in combat techniques, saw her only in the deepest hours of the pre-dawn, when he was in his chambers, lost in the heavy, dreamless rest of their kind. She timed her visits with careful precision, listening for the rhythm of the household, learning the patterns of his days so she could move through the fortress like a ghost, never crossing his path. She ceased to be his shadow and became invisible. She took her meals, bags of blood provided by the household servants, clinical and cold and utterly devoid of comfort, in the solitude of her rooms. She no longer joined the formal dinners, sending her regrets through a servant, claiming fatigue or study. At first, the excuses were accepted without question. She explored the fortress's forgotten corners, its dusty libraries filled with histories of people she'd never know, volumes written in languages that predated her mortal country by centuries. She spent hours tracing her fingers over faded maps of territories long since conquered or abandoned, reading accounts of wars fought under different moons. She walked the ramparts that overlooked 1,000 square miles of silent, moon-drenched forest, the wind whipping her hair around her face, and felt the vast emptiness of the world stretch out before her. The fortress, which had once felt like a labyrinth with him as the center, all paths leading inevitably back to his presence, now became her sanctuary and her training ground. She learned its secrets, the hidden staircases and forgotten passages, the rooms that hadn't been opened in decades. She found a small, circular tower room filled with broken furniture and old tapestries, and she claimed it as her own private retreat, a place where she could sit and feel the weight of her solitude without judgment. The hunger, that constant, vicious companion that all fledgling vampires battled, became a tool she learned to wield. She discovered that if she let it sharpen her senses, if she rode the edge of the thirst without giving in, she could hear a deer's heartbeat from a mile away, could track the scent of a rabbit through the dense forest, could move through the darkness with a predator's grace. She taught herself to hunt alone in the woods beyond the data fortress walls, to bring down prey with swift efficiency, to feed and return before dawn without ever being seen. She learned to move without sound, her feet learning the language of the stone floors, which tiles were loose and would betray her presence, which corridors echoed and which absorbed sound. Her existence became a monastic devotion to self-sufficiency, every moment a test of her will, every night a battle against the bond that still sang its mournful song, demanding she go to him, be near him, seek the comfort of his presence. Every instinct she mastered, every moment she survived the crushing loneliness and the physical ache of the thirst without him, was a small, bitter victory. She was forging herself into something harder, something that could endure. She was becoming a weapon, if only to defend against the weakness of her own heart. The pain was constant, a dull ache that never quite faded, but she learned to breathe through it, to function despite it. She told herself this was strength. She told herself she was becoming independent, self-reliant, everything a vampire should be. She told herself that the hollowness in her chest was just the bond adjusting, that eventually it would stop hurting, that eventually she would stop wanting to run to him every time she heard his voice in a distant corridor. She was lying to herself, but the lie was all she had. At first, Vlad felt a profound sense of relief. The air in his study seemed lighter, less oppressive. He could work through the evening without the awareness of her presence just beyond the door, without the weight of her expectation pressing on him like a physical force. The council meetings were less fraught, his attention no longer divided between the matters at hand and the silent, watching figure in the alcove. The weight of her constant, expectant gaze was lifted from his shoulders, and he found he could breathe easier, could move through his own home without the feeling of being perpetually observed. He told himself this was good, that she was finding her independence, settling into her new existence with a maturity he hadn't given her credit for. He'd given her space, respected her need to find her own way, and she was using it to grow, to become more than just his shadow. He saw it as a sign of his own wisdom, his careful handling of a delicate situation. He had recognized the pressure building between them, and by creating distance, had allowed her to flourish. Anton noted her absence with a raised eyebrow during one of their evening discussions, his pen pausing over the ledger he was updating. "The fledgling has found her footing, it seems," he observed neutrally. Vlad nodded, taking a sip of wine, the dark liquid rich and complex on his tongue. "It's for the best. She needs to learn to exist independently. The bond can be overwhelming for new vampires. I may have accelerated her growth by giving her room to breathe." The matter, it seemed, was settled. But weeks bled into a month, and the relief that had felt so liberating began to curdle into something else, something uncomfortable and unfamiliar. The silence that had once felt like freedom began to feel like a void, an absence that was too large, too profound. He would turn a corner in the fortress, his mind occupied with thoughts of trade agreements or border patrols, and half expect to see her there, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him, her lips curving into that tentative smile. Instead, he found only empty air, and the disappointment was a small, sharp shock each time. The space he had craved now felt vast and desolate, like a room that had once been full of life and was now echoing and cold. He found himself listening for the whisper of her footsteps in the hall, that particular light tread that was distinctly hers. He would pause in his work, his pen hovering over parchment, and strain to catch her scent on the castle drafts, that unique combination of night-blooming flowers and something indefinably sweet that was just Mira. But there was nothing. He would find small signs of her presence, little clues that she still existed somewhere within the vast stone walls, and each one was like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. A book on ancient cartography left open in a dusty corner of the library, its pages marked with a scrap of ribbon he recognized as coming from one of her dresses. A single dark hair on a velvet cushion in a forgotten parlor on the third floor, a room he knew was never used. The faint, lingering trace of her scent in the north tower, as if she had stood there recently, looking out over the forest. He began to track these signs without consciously intending to, his ancient predator's instincts cataloging her movements, mapping her presence even in her absence. He had wanted space, distance, room to breathe, but he hadn't wanted a haunting. He hadn't wanted to feel like he was living with a ghost. The fortress, his home for centuries, began to feel wrong. It was too quiet, too empty. He had grown so accustomed to her presence, to the knowledge that she was near, that her absence was a constant, nagging awareness, like a missing tooth his tongue couldn't stop probing. He was a fool. The realization came to him slowly, in pieces, like a dawn he didn't want to acknowledge. He had taken her desperate, fledgling need, a need born of the violent, world-shattering transformation he had inflicted upon her, and mistaken it for a personality flaw, a weakness, an inconvenience. He had treated the sacred, anchoring pull of the mate bond as a burden to be managed, rather than a gift to be cherished. She had been newly turned, ripped from everything she had ever known, thrust into a world of darkness and hunger and immortality, and the bond had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had given her an anchor, a fixed point in the chaos. And he, instead of being that anchor, had pushed her away. He had seen her reaching for him in her confusion and terror, and instead of taking her hand, had recoiled as if her touch burned. The shame of it was a physical weight in his gut, a cold, leaden thing that settled there and refused to be ignored. The realization dawned on him slowly over the course of several weeks, each day adding another layer of understanding, another cut of guilt. He had not given her space to grow. He had given her a wound and forced her to tend to it alone, in the dark. He had seen her vulnerability and called it weakness. He had taken the most natural, instinctive response of a newly turned mate and made her feel ashamed of it. What kind of monster did that? He resolved to fix it. He would go to her, find her in whatever forgotten corner of the fortress she had retreated to, and he would explain himself. He would tell her that he had been overwhelmed, that he had needed time to adjust to the intensity of the bond, that he understood now what he had done wrong. He would bridge the chasm he had so carelessly created between them, and they would start again, do better. But pride, that ancient, stubborn companion of immortals who had lived too long and seen too much, stayed his feet. He told himself to give it another week, to let her see that he could respect her newfound independence before he tried to close the distance. He didn't want to seem desperate, didn't want to undermine the self-sufficiency she had clearly worked so hard to build. He would wait for the right moment, for a natural opportunity to reconnect. Perhaps at the next formal dinner, or during a chance encounter in the library. It was a miscalculation born of pride and fear, and it would nearly cost him everything. The Eastern Corridor was a place of disuse and decay, one of the many forgotten arteries of the ancient fortress. It connected the main keep to a long-abandoned watchtower that had once served as a lookout point during the territorial wars of the previous century. The wind howled through the arrow slits in its walls, carrying with it the scent of rot and damp stone, and the wild, untamed forest beyond. The tapestries that had once lined the corridor, rich depictions of historical battles and noble lineages, were now little more than ragged shrouds hanging from rusted iron rods, their vibrant colors faded to ghostly suggestions of what they had once been. The floor was uneven, the mortar between the stones crumbling in places, and the torches that lined the walls were never lit. It was a place that had been surrendered to time and neglect. Mira was drawn to it precisely because no one else ever came here. It was a place of profound solitude, a perfect mirror for the state of her own soul. She had been tracing the faded outline of a dragon on a tattered banner, her fingers following the ghost of golden thread when the scent first hit her. It was wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that made her newly honed instincts scream in alarm. It was sour, acrid, the smell of desperation and madness and hunger that had gone too long unsatisfied. It was the smell of vampires who had not fed well or often, whose grip on sanity had frayed under the constant assault of the thirst. Rogues. Before she could react, before she could even process the information her senses were screaming at her, they were on her. 3 of them materialized from the shadows with a desperate, terrifying speed born of starvation. Their forms were gaunt, their skin stretched tight over prominent bones, their eyes lit with a feral, crimson light that spoke of minds lost to the hunger. They moved with a wild, uncoordinated aggression that was somehow more frightening than trained precision. These were not warriors. These were rabid animals. Her new instincts, honed in solitude but never tested in actual combat, screamed to life. The world slowed down, her vampire senses processing information at inhuman speed. She dodged the first lunge, throwing herself to the side as the creature's claws scraping against the stone wall where her head had been a second before, leaving deep gouges in the ancient rock. She spun, using the momentum to drive her elbow into the throat of the second attacker with all the strength her new body could muster. There was a satisfying, sickening crunch of cartilage collapsing, and the vampire staggered back, gasping. But the third was already on her, tackling her to the ground with a bone-jarring impact that drove the air from her lungs. The fight devolved into a desperate, primal brawl. It was not the elegant, controlled combat she had watched Vlad demonstrate in the training yards. It was ugly and raw and terrifying. She was all instinct, a cornered animal fighting for its life with every ounce of strength and will she possessed. She clawed at faces, aiming for eyes. She bit down on whatever flesh she could reach, the taste of thin, tainted blood, a vile shock on her tongue, nothing like the rich, clean blood she had been feeding on. She snarled and kicked and twisted, using her smaller size to her advantage, slipping out of holds that would have trapped a larger opponent. She managed to sink her fangs deep into the shoulder of the one holding her down, tearing through muscle and sinew. It screamed, a sound of pure animal agony, and recoiled just enough to give her the space to scramble back to her feet. Her dress was torn, her hair wild, and she could feel the sting of a dozen small cuts and scratches. But she was upright, and she was alive. But she was outnumbered and outmatched by sheer desperation. One of them, recovered from the blow to its throat, caught her across the ribs with a backhanded strike that had the full force of vampiric strength behind it. The impact sent her crashing into the wall with such force that the ancient stone cracked. The breath was driven from her lungs in a painful whoosh, and for a terrifying moment, the world went black at the edges, her vision tunneling. Pain exploded through her side, white-hot and disorienting. Before she could recover, a clawed hand raked across her arm, tearing through the fabric of her sleeve and the flesh beneath with brutal efficiency. The pain was unlike anything she had experienced since her turning, searing and immediate and utterly consuming. She screamed, the sound raw and desperate. Blood, her blood, dark and precious, welled up from the ragged gashes and began to drip onto the stone floor. The scent of it drove the rogues into an even greater frenzy, their eyes glowing brighter, their movements becoming more frantic. They could smell her fear, her pain, her blood, and it was like chum in the water to sharks. Something inside her snapped. It was not a conscious decision, not a technique she had learned or practiced. It was pure, distilled survival instinct meeting the raw, untamed power of her new vampiric nature. The terror, the pain, the desperate will to live all coalesced into a single point of absolute refusal. She would not die here. Not in this forgotten corridor, not alone, not like this. A wave of pure force, an extension of her will made manifest, an invisible hand of raw power erupted from her core. It wasn't a controlled technique, wasn't something she could have replicated or explained. It was a scream made solid, terror and rage given form. The air itself seemed to ripple and distort. The three rogues were lifted off their feet as if grabbed by a giant, unseen hand and hurled backward with tremendous force. They slammed into the opposite wall with bone-shattering impacts, the sound echoing through the corridor like thunder. They slumped to the ground in broken heaps, their bodies twisted at unnatural angles, stunned and gravely injured. For a moment, Mira simply stood there, swaying, her arm clutched to her chest, staring at what she had done. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. The world tilted dangerously. But survival instinct overrode shock. She didn't wait to see if they would rise again, didn't stay to assess the damage. She ran. She fled down the corridor, her feet slipping on her own blood, clutching her bleeding arm, her every breath a ragged gasp of pain and terror. The sound of her own frantic flight, the slap of her bare feet on stone, the harsh rasp of her breathing was the only thing in the world. Her mind was a blank slate of pure panic. And she didn't run toward the main keep, toward help, toward the populated areas of the fortress where servants and guards could be found. Some deep, wounded part of her couldn't bear the thought of being seen like this, broken and bleeding and terrified. She ran deeper into the fortress's forgotten ways, seeking the only comfort she had taught herself to trust over the past month: solitude. She needed to hide, to curl up somewhere dark and safe and lick her wounds alone. She was a wounded animal seeking a den. Vlad was in his study, seated at the massive oak desk that had served generations of his line, staring at a map of his territories spread out before him. He was attempting to focus on the notes Anton had prepared regarding a dispute over hunting grounds in the western forests, but his mind kept wandering. He had been thinking about Mira more and more frequently, the absence that had once felt like relief, now a constant nagging ache. He had been considering for the past several days whether it was finally time to seek her out, to bridge the distance between them. And then the scent hit him. It was faint at first, carried on the complex, ever-shifting currents of air that moved through the ancient fortress's many corridors and chambers, but it cut through every other smell, every other thought, with the precision of a blade. Blood. Her blood. He recognized it instantly, that unique scent that was hers and hers alone, and beneath it, woven through it like a poison, was the acrid, unmistakable tang of her terror, her pain. It bypassed his mind entirely, striking him directly in the soul like a physical blow. The bond, which had been a quiet, aching hum for weeks, a constant background noise he had learned to tune out, now shrieked. It didn't just hum or pull. It screamed with a pain and terror that was not his own, but that he felt as if it were carved into his own flesh. Something was wrong. Something was catastrophically, terribly wrong. She was hurt. She was afraid. And she was alone. He was moving before he had formed a conscious thought, before his rational mind could catch up to the primal, overwhelming instinct that seized control of his entire being. The map was forgotten. His chair sent crashing to the floor behind him as he lunged to his feet. He burst from his study with such force that the heavy oak door slammed against the wall, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. Anton, who had been approaching with a ledger, saw the look on his master's face and wisely pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide. He had served Vlad for over 2 centuries and had never seen that expression. That utterly feral, devastating combination of terror and rage. Vlad didn't even register Anton's presence. He moved through his home not as the controlled, civilized ruler he presented to the world, but as the ancient predator he truly was, his senses stretched to their absolute limit, hunting the source of that scent with single-minded, terrifying focus. His speed was inhuman, a blur of shadow and motion. His ancient power, usually kept carefully leashed, coiled in his gut like a living thing, ready to be unleashed on whatever had dared to harm his mate. He followed the fading, terrible trail of her pain and fear down corridors he hadn't walked in years, through parts of the fortress that had been abandoned to time. The scent grew stronger, more immediate, and with it came other scents, the sour, desperate smell of rogues, the coppery tang of more blood, the ozone-like smell of raw power having been discharged. His mind, usually so calculating and controlled, was a white-hot storm of fear and fury. If she was dead, if he was too late, if he had pushed her away only to lose her to some filthy, starving rogues in his own home, he would raise the world. He would hunt down every rogue in existence and make them suffer for an eternity. But beneath the rage was a terror so profound it threatened to undo him. Please, he found himself thinking, a prayer to gods he no longer believed in. Please let her be alive. Please. He found the eastern corridor. The scene of the fight was a tableau of violence that made even his ancient, battle-hardened heart clench. The bodies of 3 rogues were broken and still, slumped against the far wall in positions that spoke of tremendous force. Their bones were shattered, their bodies twisted. They would recover eventually, vampire resilience being what it was, but they would be unconscious for hours. But it was the other signs that made his non-existent heart seize in his chest, that made the world tilt and narrow to a single, horrifying focus. The dark, arterial splash of blood against the wall, vivid and fresh. the long, deep gouges in the ancient stone, evidence of claws that had sought to kill. And on the floor, a trail of drops leading away, each one a small, perfect circle of her blood, already beginning to darken and cool on the flagstones. He knelt, his fingers hovering over the largest pool, not quite touching. The scent of it was overwhelming, intoxicating and horrifying in equal measure. This was her life, her essence, spilled on cold stone. And she had been alone. She had fought for her life in this forgotten, desolate place, and she had been utterly, completely alone. No guards had heard the fight. No one had come to her aid. She had faced death and survived by her own strength, her own desperate will. The careful, ordered world he had built for himself over centuries, the control he prided himself on, the distance he had so carefully cultivated, shattered into a million pieces. All his justifications, all his careful reasoning about needing space and fostering her independence, were revealed for exactly what they were: the pathetic, selfish, cowardly posturing of a fool. He had pushed her away. He had made her feel unwanted, a burden, too much. He had left her so isolated, so convinced that she had to handle everything alone, that when danger came, when death came for her in his own fortress, she had no one to call for. She hadn't even run toward help. She had run deeper into isolation, seeking solitude even in her terror, because that was all he had taught her she was allowed to have. The breath he had claimed she was stealing from him now caught in his own throat, thick and choking with self-loathing. The space he had craved felt like a chasm, and he was staring into its depths, seeing exactly what his pride had cost him. He had almost lost her. Not to an enemy army or a political rival's machinations, not to some grand, worthy threat, but to a handful of starving rogues and to his own cruel, careless words. The silence she had given him, the absence he had initially welcomed, was not a gift or a sign of growth. It was a judgment, and he had failed it utterly and completely. He rose, his jaw clenched so tightly his fangs cut into his own lip, and followed the trail of blood drops. They led him through a series of narrow passageways, up a winding stone staircase that was barely wide enough for one person, toward the outer towers. Each drop was a condemnation, a physical marker of his failure. He found her in a small circular room at the top of a disused spire, a place so remote and forgotten he wasn't entirely certain he had ever been in it before. The room was bare except for a single narrow window and a few broken pieces of old furniture. She was huddled on the floor in the corner farthest from the door, her back pressed against the cold stone wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. Her shoulders were trembling, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps that might have been sobs or might have been the aftermath of shock. The wound on her arm was deep and vicious, a ragged tear that ran from her shoulder nearly to her elbow. Her dress was torn and soaked with blood. She was trying, with shaking hands and a scrap of her ruined tunic, to clean the wound, but her movements were clumsy, uncoordinated with pain and shock. She was so focused on her task, so locked in her own private hell, that she didn't hear him approach. The sight of her, so small and so utterly alone in her suffering, broke something fundamental deep inside him, some last bastion of pride and distance that he had been clinging to. This was his mate, his responsibility, the other half of his soul, and she was bleeding and terrified and tending to her own wounds in a forgotten tower because he had made her believe she had to, because he had pushed her away, because he had complained that he couldn't breathe. "Mira," he said, and his voice came out as a raw whisper, scraped from the very bottom of his soul. She flinched violently at the sound, a full-bodied jerk of terror. She scrambled away from him instinctively, pressing herself harder against the far wall, as if she could somehow phase through the stone and escape. Her eyes, wide with pain and fear and shock, snapped up to meet his. And in them, he saw not relief or hope or even anger. He saw fear. Of him. He was not her savior arriving to rescue her. In her current state, raw and wounded and vulnerable, he was just another threat, another source of pain. The realization was a stake through whatever remained of his heart. "Stay away," she gasped, her voice thin and reedy, barely more than a breath. The words were a knife. "You're hurt," he said, taking a slow, careful step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, of surrender. He tried to make himself look smaller, less threatening, an almost impossible task for a creature of his size and power. "I'm fine," she lied, the words automatic, a reflex. She tried to pull herself up taller, to hide the wound behind her body, to present a facade of strength. But a wave of pain made her gasp and falter, her face going even paler, and she had to brace herself against the wall to keep from collapsing. He closed the distance between them in 2 long, silent strides that nevertheless felt like crossing a vast chasm. He knelt before her, carefully, slowly, making himself lower than her, less threatening. His eyes fixed on the gash on her arm, and the sight of it, the deep, ragged tear in her pale flesh, the blood still seeping sluggishly from the wound, made rage and guilt war in his chest with such intensity he thought he might shatter from it. The smell of her blood was intoxicating, a siren call to the predator within him, the ancient hunger that lived in every vampire. But for the first time in his long, long life, the predator was utterly silent, completely eclipsed by the mate, by the overwhelming need not to feed but to protect, to heal, to comfort. All he felt was a vast, cavernous ache of guilt and a desperate, clawing need to fix this, to take her pain away. He reached out, his hand moving slowly, telegraphing his intentions. His fingers hovered a mere inch from her arm, not touching, waiting for permission. "Let me," he pleaded, and his voice was thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries, raw and unguarded and utterly genuine. "Please, Mira, let me help you." She stared at his outstretched hand as if it were a foreign object, something she couldn't quite comprehend. Her breathing was still ragged, her eyes glassy with pain and shock. He saw the war playing out behind her eyes, clear as day, the instinct to recoil, to protect the hard-won solitude that had been her only shield for weeks, warring with the raw, undeniable pull of the bond. The bond was singing now, a high, keening note of pain and need and recognition. He was here. Her mate was here. And despite everything, despite the hurt and the distance and the terrible words, the bond wanted her to lean into him, to accept his help, to let him close. Slowly, hesitantly, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a single, jerky nod. The relief that flooded through him was dizzying. He took her arm with a tenderness that felt utterly alien in his own hands, hands that had wielded swords and torn apart enemies, and ruled with an iron grip for centuries. His touch was cool against her feverish skin, gentle in a way he hadn't known he was capable of. He examined the wound with a healer's eye, his expression growing grimmer with each passing second. It was deep, the claws having torn through muscle and possibly scraped bone. It was laced with the filth and taint from the rogue's claws, which meant it would be slower to heal, more painful. Left untreated, it could fester. It would heal eventually, vampire resilience being extraordinary, but it would take days, and those days would be agony. He looked from the wound, with its angry, inflamed edges and the blood that still seeped from it, back to her face. He saw the tear tracks that stained her pale cheeks, cutting through the dirt and blood. He saw the defiant terror in her eyes, the way she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. And he saw, with devastating clarity, exactly what he had done to her. "I did this," he said, the words torn from the very depths of his soul, raw and jagged. The confession felt like ripping out his own heart. This is my fault. Mira shook her head, a small, jerky movement, her eyes sliding away from his. It was Rogue's, she said, her voice barely audible. I should have been more careful. I shouldn't have been in that part of the fortress alone. No, he interrupted, his voice dropping, becoming rough with the weight of confession. He wouldn't let her take the blame, wouldn't let her make excuses for his failure. You were alone. You were hurt, and you were alone and terrified, and you didn't run for help. You ran deeper into isolation because of me, because I was a blind, arrogant, unforgivable fool. He finally met her gaze fully and held it, and for the first time in weeks, he let every wall drop. He let her see all of it, the shame that was eating him alive, the regret that was a constant weight in his chest, the gut-wrenching terror that had seized him when he'd smelled her blood, the understanding of how badly he had failed her. I thought I needed space, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. I thought your presence, your need for me, was too much. I told Anton I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of your constant need to be near me. It was a lie, Mira. A lie I told myself because I was afraid, terrified. He swallowed hard. Afraid of the depth of what I felt for you, of how completely you have undone me from the moment I turned you. You walked into my existence and turned 500 years of careful control into chaos. The bond terrified me because it gave you power over me, made me vulnerable in a way I haven't been since I was a new vampire myself. And I responded by pushing you away, by making you feel like your very presence was a burden. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I almost lost you, learning how wrong I was. I stood in my study tonight, staring at maps and papers, craving the silence I'd demanded, while you were fighting for your life down a forgotten hallway. Alone, bleeding, terrified. And you didn't even think to call for help, did you? You didn't think anyone would come. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible. Mira's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, running down her cheeks. He could see that he'd struck directly at the truth, at the deepest wound. He lowered his head, and in a gesture that would have shocked anyone who knew him, that would have been unthinkable for a vampire king, he rested his forehead against her knee in complete supplication, in utter surrender. It was a position of absolute vulnerability, offering her his neck, the most defenseless posture a vampire could assume. Mira, he whispered into the fabric of her torn dress, forgive me, please. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask, but please. She looked down at the dark head bowed before her, at this ancient, powerful being who ruled a vast domain and commanded the respect and fear of countless vampires, reduced to this. His words echoed in the small, silent room, stripping away all the pretense, all the power, all the carefully maintained distance and pride. He wasn't the cold, untouchable ruler of a dark kingdom. He was just a man, just her mate, broken with guilt and fear and regret. She felt the tears she had been holding back for weeks, the ones she'd swallowed down during countless lonely nights, begin to fall in earnest now, hot and silent and unstoppable. The weeks of loneliness crashed over her, all the nights she'd spent forcing herself to be strong, to deny the ache in her soul, to ignore the bond that screamed for him. His confession didn't magically heal the wound he'd inflicted on her heart, didn't erase the words she'd overheard or the month of isolation. But it acknowledged the wound. It saw her pain. It validated that what had happened was real and terrible, and not just her being too needy, too weak, too much. She didn't offer forgiveness. Forgiveness was not a thing that could be given so easily. not for this. The hurt went too deep, had carved itself into her bones during those long, solitary weeks. Instead, she offered him something harder, something that would require more of him than absolution. She offered a challenge. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely a whisper, but it was laced with the hard-won steel she had forged in her solitude, the strength she had built in the forgotten corners of his fortress. Prove it. Epilogue. 1 year later. Mira stood in the great hall beside Vlad as he addressed the assembled court, and she felt no anxiety, no need to shrink into shadows or make herself small. His hand rested naturally at her waist, not possessive but grounding, a connection freely given and freely received. She had grown into her immortality with grace and strength, becoming not just his mate but his true partner, her voice heard and respected in council, her instincts trusted in matters of the domain. The wound on her arm had healed completely, leaving only the faintest silver scar that she sometimes traced absently, a reminder not of pain, but of the moment everything changed. Vlad had proven himself in 1,000 quiet ways over the months that followed. In his patience when she struggled, in his pride when she succeeded, in the way he sought her presence not out of duty, but out of genuine desire for her company, her thoughts, her touch. The bond between them no longer felt like a chain or a burden, but like what it was always meant to be, a bridge, connecting two souls who had learned that true love was not about needing someone so desperately you lost yourself, nor about pushing someone away to protect your own space, but about choosing each other every single night, in a balance as perfect and natural as the moon rising over their eternal domain. She turned her head to look at him as he spoke, saw the way his eyes found hers in the middle of his address, the way his expression softened for just a heartbeat before returning to the commanding presence his court required, and she smiled. They had both learned to breathe together, and the air had never been sweeter.